When I observe the world around me, I see countless moral systems competing for authority, religious traditions, cultural customs, personal preferences, and societal norms all claiming to define right and wrong. Yet in my years in Königsberg, developing what would become the critical philosophy, I discovered something remarkable. Beneath this apparent chaos lies a universal moral law accessible to every rational being. This law doesn't depend on what any culture believes, what any religion teaches, or what any individual desires. It emerges from the very structure of reason itself. Today, we live in an increasingly connected world where different moral traditions collide daily. The question becomes urgent: is there any foundation for ethics that transcends cultural boundaries? Can we discover moral principles that apply universally, not because some authority commands them, but because reason itself demands them? The answer lies in understanding how the moral law operates as a rational necessity, not a cultural artifact. Through careful analysis, we can see why this law provides the only solid foundation for human dignity and ethical action in our diverse, modern world. Chapter 1: The Crisis of Moral Relativism. In contemporary American society, we face a profound crisis that would have been familiar to me during the Enlightenment: the collapse of traditional moral authorities without adequate rational replacement. I observe how many conclude that since cultures disagree about ethics, morality itself must be merely relative, a dangerous error that undermines the very possibility of genuine moral discourse. Consider how this relativism manifests in practice. When confronted with practices like female genital mutilation, honor killings, or systematic oppression, the cultural relativist must either remain silent or make arbitrary appeals to their own cultural preferences. They cannot coherently condemn these practices without implicitly acknowledging universal moral standards. This reveals the internal contradiction of relativism. It assumes universal tolerance while denying universal moral truths. During my critical period, I recognize that this crisis stems from a fundamental confusion between the empirical and the rational. Cultural practices are empirical facts. They describe what people do believe about morality. But from the fact that cultures disagree, it doesn't follow that no objective moral truths exist. This commits what philosophers call the genetic fallacy, confusing the origin of our moral beliefs with their validity. The deeper problem lies in seeking moral foundations in the wrong place entirely. When we ground ethics in culture, tradition, emotion, or even divine command, we make morality dependent on contingent factors outside reason itself. Culture can be mistaken, traditions can be corrupt, emotions can mislead, and even religious interpretations can err. But reason, properly employed, provides universal access to moral truth. This is why I developed the transcendental method. Instead of asking what people happen to believe about morality, we ask what rational beings must believe if they are to act morally at all. This approach reveals that certain moral principles are not cultural artifacts but rational necessities. They emerge from the very structure of practical reason itself. The stakes of this investigation extend far beyond academic philosophy. In a world where different moral systems interact constantly, through immigration, globalization, and digital communication, we desperately need rational criteria for evaluating competing moral claims. Without such criteria, we're left with either arbitrary cultural chauvinism or paralyzing relativism. Neither option respects human dignity or provides guidance for the complex moral decisions facing modern societies. Chapter 2: The Universal Structure of Practical Reason. Through decades of analyzing the conditions that make moral action possible, I discovered that practical reason operates according to universal laws just as theoretical reason does in mathematics and science. This isn't a matter of cultural convention but of logical necessity. Any rational being capable of moral action must acknowledge these principles. The key insight emerged from examining what we actually do when we make moral decisions. We don't simply follow impulses or cultural programming, we deliberate, we consider principles, we ask whether our actions could be universally adopted. This capacity for rational moral reflection reveals something profound. We're not merely sophisticated animals responding to evolutionary programming or cultural conditioning. We're rational agents capable of acting according to self-imposed laws. Consider the structure of moral reasoning itself. When you face an ethical dilemma, you naturally ask questions like, what if everyone did this? Would I want to live in a world where this behavior was universal? Does this action respect the dignity of those affected? These aren't culturally specific questions, they emerge from the rational structure of moral agency itself. This is why the categorical imperative takes the form it does. Act only according to that maxim whereby you can at the same time will that it should become a universal law. This isn't an arbitrary rule I invented, but a formal expression of what rational moral deliberation actually requires. When we think morally, we necessarily think universally. We seek principles that could govern all rational beings, not just our particular group or situation. The universality here is formal, not material. I'm not claiming all cultures must adopt identical practices, but that all valid moral principles must pass the test of universalizability. A principle like, keep promises, can be universalized because a world where everyone kept promises is rationally conceivable and desirable. But, break promises whenever convenient, cannot be universalized because it undermines the very institution of promising. This reveals why cultural moral systems often contain genuine insights despite their apparent disagreements. When cultures prohibit murder, theft, or betrayal, they're responding to rational moral requirements, even if they justify these prohibitions through different religious or traditional frameworks. The underlying rational structure remains constant across cultures. What varies culturally is not the fundamental structure of morality but its application to specific circumstances. Different societies face different challenges and must work out how universal moral principles apply to their particular situations. This explains cultural variation without embracing relativism. The moral law provides universal constraints within which legitimate cultural variation can occur. Understanding this distinction proves crucial for navigating modern moral challenges. We can respect cultural diversity while maintaining that some practices genuinely violate universal moral requirements that any rational being must acknowledge. Chapter 3: Human Dignity as Rational Foundation. The most profound discovery of my moral philosophy concerns the source of human dignity, not in divine decree, cultural tradition, or utilitarian calculation, but in the rational nature that makes moral agency possible. This dignity provides the substantive foundation for universal moral law, transcending all cultural and historical boundaries. Consider what makes humans unique in the natural order. Unlike animals that act from instinct or objects that follow physical laws, rational beings can act according to self-imposed principles. We can evaluate our desires, resist immediate impulses, and choose actions based on moral considerations rather than mere inclination. This capacity for rational self-determination constitutes the essence of human dignity. This leads to my second formulation of the categorical imperative: act so that you treat humanity, whether in your own person or in that of another, always as an end and never merely as a means. This principle doesn't emerge from any particular culture but from recognizing what rational agency necessarily entails. When we treat someone merely as a means, we deny their capacity for rational self-determination. We reduce them to an object for our purposes rather than recognizing them as a rational agent capable of making their own moral decisions. This violates something fundamental about what makes them human, their dignity as rational beings. This insight proves revolutionary for addressing contemporary moral challenges. Take the debate over artificial intelligence and automation. The concern isn't simply that machines might replace human labor, but that treating humans as nothing more than economic units, replaceable means to productive ends, violates their essential dignity as rational agents. Similarly, in bioethics, the principle illuminates why certain practices feel morally troubling even when they might produce good consequences. Using people as unwilling subjects for medical experiments, even to save others, treats them merely as means to our ends. It denies their right to rational self-determination about what happens to their own bodies. The universality of human dignity also provides a foundation for human rights that transcends cultural boundaries. While cultures may disagree about many moral practices, the recognition of rational agency as the source of dignity provides a universal basis for protecting certain fundamental freedoms, those necessary for rational self-determination itself. This includes freedom of thought and expression, since rational agency requires the ability to form and communicate beliefs. It includes freedom from arbitrary coercion, since dignity requires that rational beings be able to make their own choices about their lives. And it includes basic material conditions necessary for the development and exercise of rational capacities. What makes this foundation genuinely universal is that it doesn't depend on any particular cultural or religious tradition. Any society that recognizes the reality of moral responsibility, that people can be held accountable for their actions, already implicitly acknowledges human rational agency and dignity. The moral law simply makes explicit what this recognition logically entails. This provides a powerful tool for moral criticism across cultures. Practices that systematically deny people's capacity for rational self-determination, through oppression, indoctrination, or dehumanization, can be criticized not from the perspective of any particular culture, but from the universal requirement to respect human dignity as rational agency. Chapter 4: Goodwill and the Purity of Moral Motivation. In developing my moral philosophy, I made a startling discovery that challenges much conventional thinking about ethics. The only thing unconditionally good in the world is a good will, the disposition to act from duty rather than from inclination, consequence, or external reward. This insight proves crucial for understanding why the moral law transcends cultural variation and personal preference. Most moral systems focus primarily on outcomes, producing happiness, reducing suffering, or achieving social harmony. While these goals may be valuable, they cannot provide the foundation for universal moral law because they depend on contingent empirical facts about what promotes human welfare. Cultures disagree about what constitutes genuine happiness or social good, and these disagreements seem irresolvable through pure reason. But notice something remarkable about moral praise and blame. We don't simply evaluate actions by their results. We care deeply about the agent's motivation. A person who helps others only for personal gain receives less moral credit than someone who helps from genuine concern for others' welfare. A person who accidentally prevents harm while pursuing selfish goals doesn't deserve moral praise for the good outcome. This reveals that moral worth lies not in external results but in the internal disposition to act rightly regardless of personal inclination or expected consequences. The good will represents this disposition, the commitment to act from duty even when duty conflicts with desire, advantage, or social pressure. Consider how this applies to contemporary moral challenges. In business ethics, we distinguish between companies that adopt ethical practices for genuine moral reasons versus those that do so merely for public relations or legal compliance. Both might produce identical external results, but we rightly judge their moral worth differently based on motivation. The same principle applies to personal relationships. Someone who remains faithful to their spouse only because of social pressure or fear of consequences demonstrates less moral worth than someone who remains faithful from genuine respect for their commitments and their spouse's dignity. The external behavior might be identical, but the moral quality differs fundamentally. This focus on motivation rather than outcome provides the key to understanding moral universality. While cultures disagree about what external results constitute human flourishing, the structure of moral motivation remains constant across rational beings. Every culture recognizes the difference between acting from genuine moral commitment versus acting from mere prudence, tradition, or external pressure. The Good Will also explains why moral education cannot simply involve learning cultural rules or calculating consequences. It requires developing the capacity and disposition to act from respect for moral law itself, to do the right thing because it's right, not because it's convenient, profitable, or socially expected. This proves especially relevant in our contemporary context where many face moral decisions in situations their cultures never anticipated. When dealing with genetic engineering, artificial intelligence, global climate change, or international human rights, we cannot simply rely on traditional cultural guidance. We need the capacity to think through moral principles and act from genuine moral commitment rather than mere custom or convenience. The purity of moral motivation also provides a foundation for moral equality that transcends all cultural and social distinctions. Rich and poor, educated and unschooled, powerful and powerless, all possess equally the capacity for goodwill, the ability to act from moral duty rather than mere inclination. This capacity constitutes their fundamental moral dignity as rational agents. Chapter 5: Freedom and Moral Responsibility in Deterministic World. One of the most profound challenges to universal moral law comes from the apparent tension between moral responsibility and natural determinism. If human actions result from prior causes according to natural laws, how can we hold people morally responsible? My resolution of this antinomy through the distinction between the sensible and intelligible worlds provides crucial insight into the nature of moral agency. In the sensible world, the realm of empirical experience, everything indeed follows natural laws. Neuroscience and psychology reveal how our actions result from brain states, genetic predispositions, cultural conditioning, and environmental influences. From this perspective, moral responsibility seems impossible because our choices appear as determined as any other natural phenomena. Yet something remarkable occurs when we shift to the practical standpoint. In deliberating about action, we cannot help but regard ourselves as free. When facing a moral choice, the question, "What should I do?" assumes that multiple options remain genuinely open. Even the most committed determinist, when deciding whether to break a promise, experiences the choice as real rather than illusory. This reveals that we necessarily inhabit two standpoints simultaneously. As objects of empirical investigation, we're part of the natural order, subject to causal laws. But as agents of moral action, we must regard ourselves as free, capable of acting according to self-imposed principles rather than mere natural necessity. The key insight is that these perspectives are not contradictory but complementary. Freedom and determinism apply to different aspects of human existence. Empirical psychology can investigate the natural causes of human behavior without undermining the practical necessity of regarding ourselves as free agents when making moral decisions. Consider how this applies to contemporary debates about criminal justice. From the empirical standpoint, we can study how poverty, trauma, mental illness, and social conditions contribute to criminal behavior. This knowledge proves valuable for developing effective interventions and understanding the complex causes of antisocial conduct. But from the moral standpoint, we must still hold people responsible for their actions because treating someone as a moral agent, capable of responding to reasons and changing their behavior, expresses respect for their human dignity. To excuse all wrongdoing as merely the product of natural causes would be to deny people's fundamental capacity for rational self-determination. This dual perspective also illuminates debates about addiction, mental illness, and other conditions that seem to compromise moral agency. We can acknowledge the real causal influences these conditions exert while still maintaining that recovery and moral improvement remain possible through the exercise of practical reason. The resolution proves especially important for understanding moral progress across cultures and history. From the empirical standpoint, we can study how moral beliefs change due to economic conditions, technological development, and cultural evolution. But from the practical standpoint, we can still evaluate these changes as genuine progress or regress according to rational moral standards. This explains why cultures can legitimately be criticized for practices that violate universal moral principles, even when these practices result from complex historical and social causes. Understanding the causes of moral error doesn't excuse it, it reveals opportunities for rational moral improvement. The freedom presupposed by moral responsibility is not the absence of all influence or the ability to violate natural laws. It's the capacity to act according to rationally self-imposed principles rather than mere natural inclination. This capacity exists wherever rational beings can deliberate about moral questions and choose actions based on moral considerations. This insight provides hope for moral education and social reform while acknowledging the real challenges posed by natural and social influences on human behavior. Chapter 6: The Rational Faith and Moral Hope. In my analysis of practical reason, I discovered that moral action necessarily involves certain rational postulates that cannot be proven theoretically but must be assumed if the moral life is to make sense. These postulates, the existence of God, the immortality of the soul, and the reality of human freedom, reveal how moral commitment transcends cultural boundaries by pointing toward universal human hopes and aspirations. The need for these postulates emerges from examining what moral action actually requires. When we act from duty, we necessarily aim at the highest good, the union of virtue and happiness. But empirical observation reveals that virtue and happiness often conflict in this world. Good people suffer while evil people prosper. This creates a rational tension that demands resolution if moral effort is to remain meaningful. Consider the practical implications of this dilemma. If virtue and happiness remain forever disconnected, if moral effort ultimately proves futile, then rational beings would have compelling reason to abandon morality in favor of prudent self-interest. The moral law would become merely an arbitrary imposition rather than a rational requirement. But practical reason cannot accept this conclusion without undermining itself. To act morally, we must assume that the moral law is not ultimately futile, that virtue and happiness can somehow be united, even if not in this empirical world. This leads to the rational postulate of God's existence as the guarantor of this ultimate harmony. Similarly, since this union cannot be achieved in our finite empirical existence, practical reason must postulate the soul's immortality to provide sufficient scope for moral development. And since moral responsibility requires genuine agency, we must postulate human freedom despite empirical appearances of determinism. These postulates reveal something profound about the universal structure of moral consciousness. Across cultures, we find remarkably similar hopes and aspirations, that justice will ultimately prevail, that moral effort has lasting significance, that human beings possess genuine dignity and agency. These aren't merely cultural artifacts but rational necessities that emerge from moral consciousness itself. This provides a new perspective on religious and cultural diversity. While cultures express these rational postulates through different symbolic systems and institutional forms, the underlying rational structure remains constant. The Christian hope for eternal life, the Buddhist belief in karma and rebirth, the secular humanist faith in moral progress, all express the same rational necessity to believe that moral action has ultimate significance. This insight proves especially relevant for addressing contemporary challenges that require global cooperation. Climate change, pandemic response, economic inequality, and technological governance all demand moral commitment that transcends immediate self-interest. People must believe that their moral efforts contribute to something larger and more lasting than their individual welfare. The rational postulates also illuminate why moral education cannot be purely secular or purely religious. Secular approaches that ignore ultimate questions about meaning and purpose fail to address the rational needs that drive moral commitment. But religious approaches that ground morality in mere authority rather than rational reflection fail to respect human dignity as rational agency. Instead, moral education must help people understand how their particular cultural and religious traditions express universal rational postulates. This allows for genuine religious and cultural diversity while maintaining commitment to universal moral principles. The postulates also explain why moral conviction often feels like a form of faith rather than mere theoretical knowledge. We cannot prove that justice will ultimately prevail or that moral effort has lasting significance. But practical reason demands that we act as if these beliefs were true, because moral action itself presupposes their validity. This rational faith differs fundamentally from blind faith or wishful thinking. It emerges from the logical requirements of moral action itself. Anyone who takes morality seriously must implicitly affirm these postulates, regardless of their explicit religious or philosophical commitments. Chapter 7: Applying Universal Moral Principles to Contemporary Challenges. The true test of any moral philosophy lies in its capacity to provide guidance for the complex ethical challenges facing contemporary society. The universal principles of practical reason, the categorical imperative, respect for human dignity, and the primacy of goodwill, offer powerful tools for navigating modern moral dilemmas that transcend any single cultural tradition. Consider the challenges posed by advancing artificial intelligence and automation. Traditional cultural approaches often prove inadequate because they developed before such technologies existed. But Kantian principles provide clear guidance. We must ask whether our development and deployment of AI treats human beings as ends in themselves rather than merely as means to economic or technological advancement. This analysis reveals serious concerns about current trends. When companies automate human labor without considering the dignity and welfare of displaced workers, they treat these workers merely as expendable means to profit maximization. A Kantian approach would require considering how technological development can enhance rather than diminish human rational agency and self-determination. Similarly, in bioethics, the principle of human dignity provides universal guidance that transcends cultural and religious differences. Whether dealing with genetic engineering, assisted reproduction, or end-of-life care, we must ask, do these practices respect the rational agency of all persons involved? Do they treat people as ends in themselves rather than merely as means to others' goals? Take the complex issue of genetic enhancement. While cultures disagree about what constitutes human perfection or improvement, the principle of rational agency provides clear constraints. Genetic modifications that enhance cognitive capacity or reduce disease susceptibility could respect human dignity if they expand people's capacity for rational self-determination. But modifications imposed without consent or that create systematic inequalities in rational agency would violate fundamental moral principles. The universalizability test proves especially powerful for evaluating policies and practices in our interconnected world. Global economic practices, environmental policies, and international relations must all pass the test. Could we will that the principles governing these practices become universal laws? Consider contemporary debates about immigration and national sovereignty. Cultural approaches often lead to irreconcilable conflicts between nationalist and cosmopolitan perspectives. But the universalizability test asks, could we will that the principles governing immigration policy become universal laws that all nations follow? This reveals the moral inadequacy of both extreme positions, complete open borders and complete exclusion, while pointing toward policies that respect both legitimate national interests and universal human dignity. Climate change presents perhaps the most urgent test case for universal moral principles. Cultural approaches often fail because they prioritize short-term local interests over long-term global welfare. But the categorical imperative demands that we consider whether our environmental practices could be universalized. Could we will that all nations and individuals follow our patterns of resource consumption and environmental protection? This analysis reveals the moral necessity of international cooperation and individual lifestyle changes that many people resist for cultural or economic reasons. The moral law transcends these particularistic concerns by appealing to our shared rational nature and responsibility for future generations. In addressing social inequality and injustice, Kantian principles provide tools that transcend ideological divisions. Rather than debating competing visions of social organization, we can ask, do existing institutions and practices respect the rational agency and dignity of all persons? Do they provide everyone with genuine opportunities for moral and rational self-development? This approach reveals why both extreme inequality and authoritarian equality violate human dignity. Extreme inequality denies many people the material and educational conditions necessary for developing their rational capacities. But authoritarian equality denies people the freedom to make their own choices about how to live their lives. The key insight is that universal moral principles don't dictate specific policy solutions but provide rational constraints within which legitimate democratic deliberation can occur. They rule out practices that clearly violate human dignity while leaving room for cultural variation and democratic choice about how best to realize these principles in particular circumstances. Conclusion. Through this analysis, we have seen that the moral law provides the only adequate foundation for ethics in our diverse, interconnected world. Unlike cultural traditions, religious authorities, or utilitarian calculations, practical reason offers universal principles accessible to all rational beings regardless of their particular background or circumstances. The categorical imperative, respect for human dignity, and the primacy of good will transcend cultural boundaries not through arbitrary imposition but through rational necessity. These principles emerge from the very structure of moral consciousness itself. They represent what any rational being must acknowledge when thinking seriously about ethics. In our contemporary context, facing challenges that no single culture anticipated, we desperately need such universal guidance. Climate change, technological development, global inequality, and international cooperation all require moral principles that transcend particular interests and perspectives. Only by recognizing our shared rational nature and moral dignity can we hope to address these challenges successfully while respecting the legitimate diversity of human cultures and ways of life.